Generative adversarial networks are currently the best kind of deep learning model that we have for generating synthetic media. Examples of their output are widely available and often turn up in the mainstream press. And they're also a popular technique used in the creation of deep fake media, which we'll talk more about next week. They are, again, like VAEs, unsupervised models that can, at least in their basic form, be trained on unlabeled data. It does turn out that they can be encouraged to produce better results with class conditionality, and so labeled data may be useful and training in a kind of semi-supervised fashion, but entirely unsupervised training is perfectly feasible. Like variational autoencoders, GANs are generative models that learn a latent distribution and learn how to map from that to some external data distribution. Unlike VAEs, the latent space is not learned by trying to reconstruct encoded training example data. In fact, in a GAN, the generator will never see any ground truth training examples at all. It only ever starts from random noise vectors sampling its latent distribution. Instead, a GAN's generator's output are evaluated on the basis of how convincing they are. This convincingness is assessed by a second model trained alongside the generating model known as the discriminator. The discriminator model, known as D, is tasked with separating out real data from fake data. It functions just as a straightforward binary classifier, and it's trained in supervised mode, but the labels for the supervision just depend on what the source of data is that's being used. Is it real data, or is it fake data produced by the generator model? So this is kind of self-labeling, given we know which different sources we are taking the data from. The loss for the discriminator would typically be something like a standard binary cross-entropy. The generator model, known as G, is tasked with generating fake data given any random input vector from some specified distribution. And this data needs to fool the discriminator model D. So the loss function for G is some function of the losses emitted by D. Particularly, it might just be the negation of the D loss. In this case, the combination of the two models, the discriminator D and the generator G, can be considered as a zero-sum game. Whatever the discriminator manages successfully to distinguish is a failure on the part of the generator. Because the loss function for G depends on the output of D, which is trained alongside it, this loss is different from essentially every other loss function that we've looked at up to now. And the difference is that it isn't fixed. It isn't just established a priori and evaluated blindly. Instead, it evolves along with the training. It is non-stationary or adaptive. As D gets better at spotting fakes, G has to get better at generating them, and vice versa, in a kind of evolutionary arms race. So the process of training a generative adversarial network involves alternately training the two models in a process that looks something like this. The training of D is perfectly straightforward. It's just like training any other kind of binary classifier with labeled data. The significant difference is that for each training cycle, half of the training data is randomly sampled from the generator model G. The other half of the data is taken from unlabeled real data. The training of G is a little bit more involved because its loss function requires that D is evaluated as well. The forward pass for G has to go all the way through G and D to generate the loss, and the backwards pass has to back propagate through D and back through G in order to estimate the gradients. Although D participates in the training of G, it doesn't learn anything in this phase. D's weights are held fixed while G is being trained. This avoids too much of a problem of trying to hit a moving target. But although this process is marginally more complicated than training a normal model, it's still just a matter of having a forward pass, back propagating, and then updating the weights by stochastic gradient descent or some similar method. One limitation of this structure is that the outputs of G, the things that get passed into D, have to be differentiable. And that generally means that they'll need to be continuous data. It's harder to have a generator that produces discrete data and passes that to the discriminator. It's possible, but it needs to go through some kind of continuous or differentiable proxy, such as an embedding space. So the models G and D in a generative adversarial network are adversarial in the sense that they have opposing goals. One is trying to detect the data, the other is trying to fool the detector. The metaphor used in the original GAN paper was of counterfeiters and detectives trying to thwart each other's plans. Note, however, that the discriminator will pass information in the form of gradients back to the generator. This is something that we wouldn't really expect the police to do to a gang of counterfeiters, although who knows. The discriminator needs to do this because otherwise the generator wouldn't know where it was going wrong and how to improve its generation. As GAN inventor Ian Goodfellow points out, this might be better understood in cooperative rather than competitive terms as something like a teacher-student relationship. The discriminator is critical, but it's doing so in order to enable the generator to generate better. Just as with variational autoencoders, it is possible to add labels or other class conditional information into the input along with the random vector sampling from the distribution, and to make the generator conditional in that way, so that you're telling the generator to produce data of a particular subset of the entire available pool. This might be things like ImageNet classes or the inevitable MNIST digits. The generative adversarial network process is reasonably straightforward to describe, but it turns out to be a little bit tricky to train in some cases. One notable problem that can arise is known as mode collapse. And essentially this means that the generator only learns a small portion of the true data distribution. It learns the things with which it relatively easily fools the discriminator, and the things that are more difficult it sort of doesn't bother with and just forgets they're there. In theory, the discriminator ought to be able to counter this by just being more skeptical of the particular regions of the data distribution that the generator is actually producing. However, in practice, you can wind up in situations where the discriminator winds up in a local minimum and never manages to stray beyond that to detect the incompleteness of the data distribution that is coming from the generator. Training a generative adversarial network is computationally demanding, and the early examples tended to be restricted to pretty small sized data sets, small images like MNIST and CIFAR 10. However, various incremental improvements have been made, and in 2019, DeepMind's Big GAN rolled in many of these incremental improvements from other models, and also just threw an awful lot of data and compute at the problem, and became a prominent example of a GAN able to produce high-resolution, high-quality photographic outputs. This model was explored entertainingly by artist Mario Klingemann, who produced images like these, exploring the latent space of the Big GAN model. One thing that's quite evident in Klingemann's images from the Big GAN latent space is the sort of entanglement of different dimensions of variation that we discussed in the context of variational autoencoders as well. One reasonably successful attempt to mitigate this entanglement is the style GAN model. In this model, they impose some additional constraints on the generator, which are described in terms of style, a term encompassing various kinds of ways in which lots of different images are similar to one another, which can often be expressed in the statistics of the activations at different depths of convolutional layers. Some entertaining illustrations of this concept of style are seen here from some of the early artistic style work, and these kinds of transformations are now readily applied, including in things like apps on your phone that will caricature your face, or camera effects in Snapchat or Instagram. Applying these kind of style constraints in style GAN successfully manages to disentangle at least some of the dimensions of variation, making it possible to identify directions that are at least somewhat associated with things like gender and types of clothing, and to use these to allow the generating process to be under greater control. Obviously, this disentanglement is extremely incomplete, and lots of different aspects of the images remain kind of mixed up together. GANs are not just used for synthesizing media, they've also been used as components in all kinds of data transformation tasks, things like denoising, as we discussed, for the variational autoencoders, things like image captioning, as we will mention in the next video about language models, and transforming between different kinds of media, making people into cartoon characters, making them older or younger, turning pencil drawings into photorealistic renderings. But the synthesis of media remains probably the most common and most notorious application. GANs put us in a situation where we're now able to synthesize reasonably convincing high-quality media of things that do not exist and have never existed. These capabilities are useful and interesting to the extent that they tell us about how the space of images works. And there are certainly practical applications for them in things like data augmentation for learning in situations where data is scarce, for example, medical imaging. But much deep learning image synthesis is of questionable utility. Some of it is curious and fun, but some of it is potentially malicious and harmful. And it does raise the question of what synthetic media is for. We'll come back to this again next week when we talk about deep fakes.